Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Jenny Ramone, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the first event in our Formation series, the book launch for SNCC Stories, the African American Freedom Movement in the Civil Rights South, which is published today by the University of Georgia Press. Formations is a year-long series of events which I'm developing with my colleagues in the Postcolonial Studies Centre at Nottingham Trent University and our partners at Bonington Gallery. The series is aligned with the decolonising agenda in art, literature, history, publishing, education and society more broadly, and foregrounds Black, Asian and minority ethnic writers, artists and workers, as well as the materials and patterns that connect communities, ideas and practices worldwide. I'm thrilled that Sharon Monteith, Distinguished Professor of American Literature and Cultural History at Nottingham Trent University, launches this series, and to welcome local and international guests. We hope that you'll enjoy the opportunity to learn more about the book and to join Sharon in conversation afterwards. The book launch will take the form of an interview before we have a wider discussion. Sharon will be interviewed by Panya Banjoko, and if you're local to Nottingham or follow UNESCO City of Literature events, you'll know her best as a patron for Nottingham UNESCO City of Literature and for holding international poetry residencies with UNESCO. As well as a published poet, Panya is director of the Nottingham Black Archive and a doctoral researcher here in the English Literature Department at NTU. In a moment, Panya will introduce Sharon and begin the interview. But before I hand over to Panya, I wanted to let you know a few details about how this event will be organised. The event will take place in two parts. An interview followed by a less formal gathering on Teams where the discussion will be open for audience questions and conversation. We expect the interview to last around 45 minutes. At the end of the interview, I will be able to pose 2 or 3 audience questions to Sharon. So if you would like me to ask a question live online, please send it to me by email using the email address at the bottom of the screen, formations@ntu.ac.uk. We'll then close this meeting and invite you to join us for the discussion using the separate link that you have received. You can also see this link on the YouTube page. If you do email me, but I don't have time to ask your question online, please do save it for the discussion. The more informal post-book launch conversation is an opportunity for everybody attending to ask questions or offer thoughts and comments, and also to socialise. So if you want to, please do bring a glass of wine or a cup of tea when you join the conversation. Thank you very much for joining us to launch Sharon Monteith's SNCC Stories, and I'm delighted to be able to hand over to Panya Banjoko to introduce Sharon.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you very much. So, Sharon Monteith, as already been stated, is a Distinguished Professor of Literature and Cultural History at Nottingham Trent University. She's written, to name just a few publications relevant to this talk, the Cambridge Companion to the Literature of the American South, American Culture in the 1960s, and Advancing Sisterhood, Interracial Friendship in Contemporary Southern Fiction. She also holds a Leverhulme Major Research Fellowship and is completing the Civil Rights Movement, A Literary History. Sharon is constantly creating opportunities for others. Evidence of this lay in the acknowledgements page of SNCC Stories, which feature both past and present researchers, and also includes me, and also evidenced by me being here this evening and having the opportunity to interview someone, you know, as fantastic as Sharon. Sharon is also my Director of Studies. She's made the journey thus far a pleasurable and a genuinely rewarding one. I'm both honoured and truly privileged to be sharing this space with Sharon today, and salute her for her tireless work to bring to the fore voices so often hidden. Good evening, Sharon.
Good evening, Panya. You've embarrassed me there. But now I guess you're going to ask me some hard questions.
Not hard questions at all, and there should be no embarrassment. If anything, I've done you a disservice. I should have written, at least a 5-page introduction for you. You deserve that.
That would have given me less time to speak. So
exactly.
All to the good.
So let's start at the beginning, Sharon. Let's start with why SNCCs? Why is SNCCs important now, and why is it important particularly to you?
That's a huge question, and I could spend the evening answering it, but I'll try to summarise. Perhaps not all of our listeners know that the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was inaugurated right at the beginning of the 1960s. It brought together students in the main who had been organising on campuses around the country, but mainly in the racially segregated US South, campaigning for civil rights. They were involved in the sit-ins in 1960, the Freedom Rides in 1961. And when they came together as a group, the woman who became an important mentor to them, 57-year-old Ella Baker, persuaded them, championed the idea that they would forge an organisation of their own. So Julian Bond, who was one of SNCC's co-founders and then its director of communications, remembered that other organisations, the SCLC, headed by Martin Luther King, and CORE, wanted these students to join with them. But they'd forged friendships in their activism, and they already had ideas about how they wanted to work. And the first cadre of around 15 organisers really forged SNCC's ethos in terms of its community organising in the US South. So embedding organisers in poor, rural and city communities and working with them, not for them, but with them, to facilitate voting registration in particular, but also direct action protests. But SNCC is rooted in now, so not just the 1960s. So even though it faded away, very much seemed to by the end of the decade, now if we look at what SNCC has done since, we see that organisers who were working in the places where SNCC set its projects continued to work there. So people like Charles and Shirley Sherrod in Southwest Georgia, and Bob Mance, Charles McLaughlin, Hollis Watkins in the Mississippi Delta, continued to do organising and activist work, and that SNCC has intervened in moments of crisis. So, for example, the Florida, in 2000, with the election in Florida where voters were suppressed, Black voters were suppressed, SNCC was very vocal. Its legacy project has been working with the Black Lives Matter movement since 2013, when that movement began in the aftermath of George Zimmerman's shooting of Trayvon Martin and his acquittal. SNCC is working with contemporary activist groups. At the moment, it's working with the NAACP, so an older established organisation established in 1909, and more recent organisations like Woke Vote, and working together on voter registration, infrequent Black voters by calling and canvassing them for this election. So SNCC's legacy project has continued over 60 years. That organising ethos has been in place. And I guess that SNCC is acting as, well, they are the veterans, they're the elders, the mentors to people in newer organisations who are working with them cross-generationally. So SNCC is important. And I think maybe thinking now about why that is too, it's because as young activists, SNCC organisers put themselves on equal footing with civil rights leaders at the time. And that, in a way, is what the Black Lives Matter activists have been doing more recently. The idea our stories in our own voices is a mantra now, but it was always a mantra for SNCC, and it was one of the reasons that behind my writing this book.
Okay, thank you for that, Sharon. So why has no one considered SNCCs activists as writers before now? Why do you think that's so?
I think there are lots of reasons. I suppose to begin with, SNCC's writing, its literature, is inextricably entwined with its activism. So from the very beginning, it created its own archive. Organisers were always writing things down, and one of the things that drew me to the project were field reports in the first instance, and I can say something about them a bit later. Mm-hmm. But SNCC was always writing, and I think one of the reasons that it wrote so much was in order to convey why this grassroots community organising approach was significant among the other approaches being taken by different civil rights organisations. So the NAACP's Legal Fund, for example, focusing on legal cases and legislation. And while SNCC did that too, it focused very much on activism on the ground with individuals who were disenfranchised. Why has nobody looked at SNCC's writers before? I think there are lots of reasons. I think that in the 1960s and since, focus on the Black arts movement has meant that a popular understanding has formed that reading and writing about race and rights was spearheaded by Black arts movement writers from around 1966 onwards. And that has contributed to the occlusion of what SNCC was writing in the first half of the 60s, and even before that, because one of the things that I look at is an unpublished novel by James Forman, which he wrote at the end of the 1950s, before SNCC even began. And he imagined his way into SNCC when he was writing that novel, I think, because he distilled the campus mood that took students into the movement and that led to the formation of SNCC. So SNCC's writers were contributing to the Black arts movement as writers, but they were also writing from the very beginning. And that was what concerned me, I think, that we would have this leap from the 1950s into the 1960s and perhaps forget these writers. I think another reason is that there's a popular assumption that people will write literature about the 1960s iteration of the civil rights movement afterwards. So in the aftermath, once things have died down and can be digested and people can think clearly. So it was often thought that activists were not writing in the moment, but that the first fictions about the 1960s movement weren't written until the 1970s and the 1980s by people who were closely involved with activists like Alice Walker or Rosalind Brown, but perhaps not at the heart of a movement organisation like the writers in SNCC. I also think that the youth of the writers contributed, because I think that it was one way in which sometimes reviewers could underread what they wrote because they were young, and because they assumed that if anybody was going to chronicle the movement in fiction, it was going to be well-known writers, particularly Southern writers. And also, I guess, once James Baldwin's voice was so powerful, if people didn't look beyond Baldwin, they didn't always see who else was writing from within organisations, even though James Baldwin did himself. So one of the examples that springs to mind is in 1986, Baldwin was talking about short stories written by Michael Thelwell of SNCC in the 1960s. And he said something like, in Thelwell's hands are pieces of a jigsaw that I don't have in my hands. In other words, he very much realised that the activists had particular stories that only they could tell. So I think that there are lots of reasons why we perhaps haven't realised how many of SNCC's activists were writers. I think another reason is that often editors of anthologies or reviewers didn't signal when a writer was always also an activist, or perhaps realised that they'd been a freedom rider, but not that they'd been embedded in an organisation for the best part of a decade. So I think that was one way in which they could be ignored too. And I wanted to give SNCC's writers their due.
And why do you think literary activism is important?
I think it was important to SNCC, and I think it's been important to other civil rights organisations, but that's been recognised with, let's say, the NAACP, because among its key figures were W.E.B. Du Bois, James Weldon Johnson, Walter White wrote novels as well as essays and histories, Bessie Fawcett. So we always knew that there were well-known writers who were part of that organisation, whereas I don't think we realised how much SNCC wrote. And particular people in SNCC were significant in forging a narrative culture. So James Foreman, as SNCC's executive secretary, brought the idea that you had to write it all down. He was forever telling people that you have to write it all down, and that if we don't preserve what we're doing, we will become preserved by somebody else. So if we're in somebody else's archive, then the terms are dictated by people other than ourselves. He sort of said, we need Tom Paine's, Richard Wright's, we need writers who will write this. And Julian Bond was a poet before he joined SNCC, and he was very much aware of the importance of writing. Key people for me have been Charles Cobb, Joyce and Dory Ladner, John O'Neill, people who were thinking about cultural programmes, particularly John O'Neill, really, and Charles Cobb, and thinking about how to share writing within SNCC. So some of it is shared between activists, not for a public audience, and so much more is shared more widely through different routes for the public.
Thank you. For people who might not have read the book yet, I mean, I've been very privileged. I've had the opportunity to read it. Can you give us an outline of some of the writers you wrote about to give us a sense of what SNCC Stories contains? A bit more of a flesh that out for us a little bit more.
Well, I'm guessing that pretty much nobody has read the book except for the very good people who wrote launch reviews. I've just picked it up now because to give you a flavour of the fact that by focusing on narrative culture, I think people in SNCC who are not the key figures in its histories, and it has a wonderful set of histories from Howard Zinn through Clay Carson, Wesley Hogan, and in the work of lots of historians from Emily Crosby, John Dittmer, J. Todd Moy. There are so many people who have written about SNCC, but not its writers. So James Foreman is clearly there, as is Julian Bond, who I've mentioned already, but Jane Stembridge, Charles Cobb, Jean Wheeler-Smith, who's very important in the book, Peter de Lisavoy, Julius Lester, Maria Varela, Gloria House, Gloria Wade-Gales, Kathleen Conwell Collins, Elaine Delott, Michael Thelwell, who's written so much, Denise Nicholas, Worth Long, Richard Hall, Mitchell Zimmerman, and Bill Mahoney. And some people who, surprisingly, perhaps to some SNCC organisers also wrote. So Sam Block, Faye Bellamy, Casey Hayden wrote a lot of poems. And I'm not even covering all of the people that I mention, but it gives you a flavour of the fact that there were a lot of writers in SNCC, and there still are.
You mentioned poets there. So SNCC writers, they seem to be prolific across a number of genres: plays, poetry, novels, short stories. Could you pick out a few of the writers to give us a sense of what they were writing about?
Yes. So I would say that let's take Charles Cobb for a moment. So Charlie Cobb, in that moment we were talking about when SNCC's writing was occluded because of the focus on the Black arts movement, I think Charlie Cobb's poetry, two major collections, major to me, In the Furrows in the World and Everywhere Is Yours. One came out in 1967, the other in 1971. What Cobb was expressing in his poetry was SNCC's thinking on Black power and on anti-Vietnam protests, because it was the first organisation to speak out openly and formally against the war. And in his poetry, there's also a sense of transnationalism. I think it's Peniel Joseph who talks about the SNCC diaspora, and the SNCC diaspora widens when you consider writers like Cobb, who compared what was happening in Selma, Alabama in 1965 with what was happening in the Mekong Delta, and who went to live in Africa and exuded a kind of Pan-Africanist sensibility in a lot of his writing. Perhaps just to give you a flavour, just very quickly. There's a section in the book that I called Everywhere Is Here after one of Cobb's poetry collections. And he's writing in the moment that Cortland Cox, who chairs the SNCC Legacy Project now, made a public statement. He said, "We have to convince the country that civil rights workers getting killed in the South because the government has a certain attitude toward killing in Vietnam. The concept is that it's all right to kill an enemy, and it affects the morality in the country so that people can be murdered here." And in Charlie's poem, published in June 1965, what Cobb does is he treats Selma, Alabama and South Vietnam as parallel war zones. He says, "The cop in Selma pulls the trigger that kills for Alabama, for God and Alabama, as he's been taught, just like his brother who fought or bombed or gassed in South Vietnam last week." And anger burns and sarcasm whips through 10 jagged verses of this poem, until in the end, federally sanctioned violence is conflated with versions of democracy in a sardonic way. He says, "Someday, maybe, if I give America a chance, I'll be able to wear the uniform and have the gun of the cop that shot Jimmy Lee Jackson, or be the commander of the army. That's what will happen to me when I'm given equality." So I think there are lots of ways in which the poetry expresses debates that were cresting within SNCC, and Charles Cobb is one example of that. Bill Mahoney published a novel called Black Jacob, and copy and show you, but that novel means a lot to me since writing about it and through writing about it, probably because it was the first novel to be published out of SNCC, and that Bill Mahoney is one of the people in SNCC who doesn't figure predominantly in its histories, and less as decades have passed. But when you think about SNCC through its narrative culture, it brings people like Bill Mahoney into the foreground, not only for what he wrote across the 1960s, which culminated in this novel in 1969, but also for the many different roles that he took within the organisation, often working with Cortland Cox, working in the Washington office. And after he left SNCC, he was touring the country, writing back to Doris Darby and Jesse Morris, trying to put together a publishing company that could get this writing out. His novel, Black Jacob, is really important because it's set mainly in a tent city, and tent cities were microcosms of local action. They were the places where plantation workers who had been ousted from plantations where they'd lived for decades, as Fannie Lou Hamer was in SNCC, where they ended up. She did not end up in a tent city, but so many people did. And there was a whole proliferation of them throughout the period in which Mahoney was writing. So he makes a tent city very visible, and SNCC's activism in a moment when organisers were exhausted and tired, and there could be tensions within the communities within which they were working, as well as defiant and dangerous work. So that novel, I think, means a lot to me. Among plays, I would say there are lots, but John O'Neill's Junebug, Jabbo Jones plays, the cycle of plays, are really important. I spend a chapter looking at two characters who were part of SNCC's folklore, so imagined in SNCC, out of conversations in SNCC. One of them is a cartoon character called Super SNCC that an organiser called Claude Weaver drew. And the other is Junebug Jabbo Jones. And this character came about out of conversations, and people have different memories about who began talking about Junebug or Jabbo. But then Michael Thelwell starts quoting him, his aphorisms in his essays. And when he edits and writes Stokely Carmichael's autobiography, he includes Junebug Jabbo Jones in the index as if he's a real person. And in some ways he was in SNCC. What John O'Neill did in writing plays with this character at the centre was he personified him on stage from 1980 to 2012, when his son took over the part. So there's also a kind of cross-generational storytelling, passing on, going on there. So plays, poetry, novels. Among short stories, I spend a lot of time on ones that Jean Willis-Smith wrote. And amongst the poets, I spend a lot of time on Gloria House, who is writing now and whose poetry is wonderful. And lots of different writers. Jane Stembridge as probably SNCC's first poet. And her first poetry collection, I Play Flute, was published out of SNCC. So SNCC, through Maria Varela created Flute Publications as an imprint that would publish Jane Stembridge, Charlie Cobb, Julius Lester. So you can see that there's a publishing culture within SNCC as well.
So can you tell me about some of the women involved in SNCCs and some of the lesser known voices?
In terms of the women, I think the women have always been writing. What's intriguing in writing this book is that SNCC's women organisers were and are as prolific writers as the men. But there are three kind of dramatis personae in SNCC's writing: the organiser, the local person who hosts SNCC in different communities, local leaders too, so maybe four, and also volunteers who worked with SNCC in Freedom Summer, for example. And the organiser is the main dramatis personae, but very, very rarely a woman. So organisers are predominantly men in the fiction. And even though women write a lot, they often also write about the organiser through male characters. When you get to Gloria House's poetry that I mentioned, the organiser is female. And I think that's very important. It was important to me to find that. Also in Gloria Wade Gale's poetry, there the organiser is female. There are lots of poems for Ruby Doris Smith Robinson, who was SNCC's executive secretary after James Forman, much loved, and who died of cancer in the 1960s. There are lots of eulogies, elegies, poems, commemorations of her as an organiser. And I think that's very important. But quite often, I think it's sad that the biographies of the women activists are just as rich. They contain so much drama. Joyce and Dorrie Ladmer, Judy Richardson. There were so many women who were so active in SNCC and still are, whose experiences, Annie Pearl Avery, who guarded SNCC's freedom houses with the gun. There are so many interesting women, and they are not as prevalent in the literature. Often women volunteers are quite prevalent, black and white. But it's something that I grapple with and think about in the book, because there are as many women writers as there are men, but it's the extent to which the women's activism comes through and where it comes through and how that interests me.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you. So you've given us a sense of the stories in the literature, but are there any stories about any particular individuals you found intriguing?
Gosh, I mean, there are lots. I find the whole thing intriguing, but then if I didn't, there'd be something wrong, wouldn't there? I suppose I was very intrigued to find that Sam Block, who initiated SNCC's project in Greenwood, Mississippi in 1962, single-handed for the first few weeks, that he'd written a play about that experience that's never been performed. But I thought it was interesting and intriguing that individuals who did not see themselves as writers were not among those who studied literature or history or philosophy at university, elected really to use fiction as a way to think through experiences and ideas. So thinking about that play intrigued me. I think another thing is that there were writers who were not in SNCC always, but who followed SNCC closely, professional writers and individuals. And among those that I talk about, Len Holt is a man who intrigues me now, and I'm continuing to work on him. He was one of SNCC's lawyers. They nicknamed him the Snake Doctor because he would slither into town. And the way in which he, as a black lawyer, spoke to his white counterparts in courts could be just as biting as a snake, and certainly sort of sharpened a sharp tongue that people appreciated. So he was celebrated in SNCC. Len Holt wrote 2 books in 1965, published 2 books, which is no mean feat for somebody who's spending his time lawyering. And they're both focused on SNCC. He joined SNCC too. But I found it really interesting that his legal prowess has been recognised and acknowledged in 2 books, one in 2010 and the other, a magisterial legal history, in 2011, but not what Len Holt wrote. And I was interested in the fact that he co-wrote with Bill Mahoney, essays and poetry, that he wrote letters to John O'Neill and Doris Darby when they were setting up the Free Southern Theatre as SNCC's cultural arm, or one of them. He helped James Forman with his writing. He actually, among the women, Elizabeth Sutherland Martinez, known Betita Martinez, I discovered how incredibly important she was as an editor and a mentor for James Forman in whatever he wrote and published. But Len Holt, I think, is intriguing to me. He also wrote a Black Power short story, and it features a version of Willie Ricks in SNCC by name, and a character called Regina. It's a two-hander, and they, in a way, it is a companion piece to the history that Charles Cobb wrote more recently. This non-violence is going to get some of us killed, when he was talking about the need for defence within SNCC's organising. So what Len Holt did, if anybody, was to celebrate in that short story somebody like Annie Pearl Avery, and to recognise that communities had always been defending SNCC as they defended themselves, even though SNCC was working non-violently in the South in what it did.
Okay. In the prologue, you reference Caroline Steedman's observation that the practice of history in its modern mode can be just one long exercise of the deep satisfaction of finding things.
Yeah.
And you go on to say it was both a touchstone and a warning. Can you elaborate on this for me?
I like Caroline Steedman's work. I like the fact that she writes subjective histories and thinks really poetically about work in archives and how we write history, the practice of writing history from archival sources. I think that was a warning to me, because if we work in archives, and so many of us do, there are these wonderful moments when you find things that change your thinking, change the direction of what you're writing. And I was aware of that, and also aware that what I didn't want to do was to write a book that said, look, this is all that SNCC wrote. These are all the things, and here's a survey of them. You know, here's a narrative survey. SNCC wrote this and this and this and this. Not to have the kind of collector's approach, but that, so that was a touchstone and a warning, because I needed to think at every turn, what might these sources tell us that SNCC's wonderful histories haven't told us already? What don't we know already? And so I needed to select the things that tell us about SNCC's internal culture, its culture, how people thought, wrote, debated, the kind of discourse they created, the metaphors and similes that they built on in writing field reports, how they thought. And so what I did need to do was to be reasonably selective. So I spend time on Jean Williams-Smith's stories when they tell us about SNCC's thinking and the internal culture in SNCC. But I don't spend time on works that don't do that. So I needed the study to cohere in that way. And that's why I think, looking back now, that was one of, I think I had a lot of guiding metaphors when I wrote this book, and that was certainly one of them.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've had the privilege to read SNCC stories, and it was both informative and also quite emotional, you know, hearing about some of the stories of the activism and what happened to the activists. What impacted you the most researching SNCC stories?
I suppose the need to write about something that it's difficult to talk about. And that was the because SNCC's organising work was so dangerous and defiant, it also damaged some people psychologically. And some people went off the grid for a while, or they never returned to activism, or they don't attend SNCC reunions. And I was conscious that they're among the unsung heroes of the movement. And I could find the places where fiction is a safer place to talk about that. On SNCC's 50th anniversary, Chuck McDew talked about the kind of post-traumatic stress syndrome that some activists had suffered as a result of white racial terrorism, white supremacist violence, and just the sheer grind of organising and the difficulties around that, as well as the rewards of working within communities. And then in 2000, Mike Miller put together an organisation within SNCC called the Walking Wounded, to kind of give back and be inclusive of people who had perhaps fallen away, maybe felt out of the fold, maybe weren't being seen as belonging to SNCC because people who had national level responsibilities, like John Lewis or Julian Bond, were being signifying as SNCC in a way that these people could not. So I was looking at fictions, and Bill Mahoney talks about this, and he is one of those people who has fallen away. Richard Hall in his novel that I talk about, and Julius Lester in a novel called And All Our Wounds Forgiven. I wanted to think about the fact that the walking wounded and the unsung are not considered on equal terms or equal memorial terms with activists like Martin Luther King. And so therefore I needed to bring them back and give them their due, because the writers had done that in a safer place of fiction, where you are not treading on the privacy of individuals. You can create composite characters and avatars instead of using names directly. And you can still stay within what SNCC has called its circle of trust, which is quite protective of those particular activists.
So was chapter 9, Walking Wounded, was that one of the most difficult chapters to write? Or
maybe not when it came to it, because I've been thinking about it for so long. I mean, I have to admit that my writing process is unlike that which I would advocate for a doctoral student, or anybody I've helped. In other words, I don't kind of write from the beginning all the way to the end. And I try, once I've got the vision of the book in my head, I try to keep it in my head and I write across it. So I'm sometimes working on multiple chapters at the same time. That's really messy. It's not good, but it's the only way I can work. But what it means in a case like this is that I'm thinking about that all the time. So I don't come to that chapter and then think, okay, how do I dig into this difficult issue? It's been coming up in my writing and thinking all the way through. And so I think that part of the process, I think I also thought, I said I had guiding metaphors. I thought about, because James Forman said we are all a book and we have our stories inside us. And Julian Bond once said SNCC's life and times could have been a novel. I think I had the idea of a book and its pages in my head. And the pages about the walking wounded were the ones that I saw were missing. Having said that, John Dittmer has written beautifully about the walking wounded in his book, Local People. And so I wanted to think about how the literature is a companion piece to what historians have uncovered. And some people have talked about that experience, Charles Sherrod being one, in an incredibly powerful short speech. So I wanted to think about how the writers were doing that, but I knew that these were some of the pages that were usually missing from thinking about SNCC's book, and that other pages are evolving. So when I put the book to press, Mitchell Zimmerman published what I think is a great novel called Mississippi Reckoning. And I just had time. The press thankfully allowed me just a little bit of time so I could make note of it in this book. I'm working on it more now. He wrote a brave book. He's written a brave book, but he wouldn't have written in the 1960s as a SNCC volunteer and activist. So I needed to think about how SNCC's book is still evolving. It's not closed. It can't be closed. Some pages are repeated, some are missing, some are uncut. But it gets bigger as writers continue to write.
Okay. So archives and print culture are a key resource in your research. Was there a particular archive useful to you in bringing this history together?
I think I singled a few out in the acknowledgements, I think, and thought it's invidious to do that because archivists are champions, and none of our books could be written without them when we work in this way. I guess I have a particular affection for the Amistad Research Centre in New Orleans. I thanked Chris Harter by name as one of the people in the acknowledgements. The reason I like the Amistad is because it has such a wonderful collection of civil rights organising art organisations. So the kind of art, literature, performance that was going on in the South in the 1960s, in the 1970s, and since. And John O'Neill's papers are there. He died relatively recently, and his papers are an absolute treasure trove to me, because he was writing about story circles in SNCC. He was writing about cultural programmes, because with Doris Darby and Gilbert Moses, he put together Free Southern Theatre. He's always thinking about performance, but his papers are there. Also, the Free Southern Theatre papers are there. The Junebug collection is there. So although I spent so much time, and always do, at the Library of Congress, at Emory's archives, Amistad has a particular place in my heart in terms of the things I've always found there. And if I'm honest, I like going off the beaten track in terms of my archive visits. And I sometimes go with a dear friend, Alison Graham, when she's searching for things, and we go off the beaten track together. And so all the kind of smaller archives, sometimes are disorganized, most of the time they're not, but all of Mississippi's and Georgia's archives. Most recently, I had a wonderful time at Valdosta State in southwest Georgia, in Deborah Davis's archive. So I think I've become an archive geek, or I don't know what I've become, but I think that they are a treasure trove, and I can only hope that in this moment, because I should have been there for 3 months and I couldn't go, that archives are making more and more things digitally available online so that we can use them, because I think that's just so important. And I know the Amistad Research Centre is certainly trying to do that.
And so were there any journals or periodicals that the SNCC's writers themselves targeted?
Lots and lots. Charlie Cobb wrote for children as well as for adults. The Massachusetts Review has far more than you might think by Black writers and the civil rights movement, for a journal that wasn't dedicated to that. In the main, Freedom Ways and Negro Digest. Freedom Ways in 1962, Julian Bond wrote very politely to Freedom Ways to say that SNCC had been overlooked in a survey of resources by civil rights organisations, and thereafter, ever after, SNCC was prevalent in its pages. So with special issues, they dominated special issues in 1964, 65, 66. Negro Digest in particular, though, because it was edited by Hoyt Fuller, and because an assistant was David Lorenz, who volunteered with SNCC in 1964. And Hoyt Fuller championed Jean Wheeler Smith and Jane Stembridge in SNCC. He put them together with Alice Walker, Sonia Sanchez, Nikki Giovanni, Carolyn Rogers as the writers that he thought were the best writers, spawned, was the word he used, from the movement. And I traced Jean Wheeler Smith Young's writing through Negro Digest. And it also carried the work of a lot of other activists too.
Just going back to the SNCC's writers themselves, what I find interesting is that they were so involved in so much activism on the ground, and it's surprising that they kept such a detailed archive, and in fact one of the most detailed archives of all civil rights organisations. Why do you think that is?
I guess I thought that not everybody in SNCC wrote or liked writing. Some people balked at the fact that they needed to produce field reports. But I think that Dorothy Miller-Zellner was one of the people who emphasised how important it was not to take things for granted. So the ways in which you organise day to day in projects might no longer seem interesting to the project organiser in terms of writing it down, because it was already known in your heart and in everything you did. But later in the movement, which is another SNCC newspaper that came out of Los Angeles, California, people shared in that publication how to organise, and gave each other, different groups gave each other ideas about what worked and what didn't. And so I think it was partly because of this idea that you have to take control of your own stories. And if you don't write them down, somebody else will write them down and maybe get them wrong. And it was also this idea of preserving history, and the fact that SNCC was always intervening when in journalism, Julian Bond was forever telling people to feed journalists stories, particularly when they didn't get things right or when they left the communities that SNCC cared most about out of the story. So I think the whole idea of writing is there. The field reports are wonderful, and what I did was I read them for how they're written, and for the fact that some people were frustrated novelists as they were writing them, and for the ways in which oftentimes that's where the ideas originate for the poems, the short stories, the novels that translate things written in field reports into other genres. There's a wonderful story by Michael Thelwell that's subtitled Notes on the Mississippi Delta that does that brilliantly. But I'm guessing I don't have time. I don't even know how long we've been talking to give you an example from that.
Yes.
I know Jenny will tell us.
Yes. I don't know how long we've been talking either. Perhaps can I just ask then, with all of these resources, these archives, all of the work produced by the SNCC writers, how then did you select from the stories and resources that you found? What was that like?
I think that came together quite organically, really, because of what I said about wanting to discern what the kind of sensibility of the movement, what it felt like to live in history and to make it. That's what Charles Cobb said at some point that I cannot now remember was missing from how we think about writing about the civil rights movement. And because I wanted imaginative sources to be part of the historiography, because I think if they're not, we miss that sensibility, we miss experiential writing. And so there are lots of debates within this book about subjectivity, collectivity. So, you know, you can't be synoptic about SNCC because it's such a heterogeneous organisation. The difficulties of writing SNCC and thinking about what it was is done in literature. And again, I think in some ways it's a safe space because memoir is not the only genre in which people chose to write. And in memoirs, there are examples where people feel the pressure, the responsibility of the other people. So they're forever calling round to try to get it right. You know, that can be a way of stopping you writing. And I think that literature was a space that in which people could exercise politics, imagination, the convergence of politics, history. Barbara Foley is a critic, a recovery researcher whose work I like. And she said something in an essay that is about history, fiction, and the ground between. And I'm not quoting her precisely, I know, but she said that literature can point towards what isn't in histories or what could have been written in other forms. And I guess I kind of think that that's something that I thought about along the way too.
Yes, brilliant. Lots of food for thought there. Were there any plays, poems, novels, etc., that you left out of these SNCC stories? And if so, and will they find their way into another publication, perhaps?
Oh yes, absolutely, and they are doing, absolutely. Yeah, that's yes. I mean, I mentioned Mitchell Zimmerman's novel. There are lots of. I mean, now I'm thinking about how other people in other civil rights organisations were writing, and also people close to the movement and across the different iterations of the long freedom movement from the Reconstruction era to Black Lives Matter. So things that I didn't or couldn't include were absolutely, in my mind, better placed in this different work that's not so focused on SNCC's particular culture.
Mm-hmm. I feel like I've had you all to myself for all this time, and that perhaps we should be moving towards opening up the discussion.
Thank you so much for that. Just a quick reminder, if anybody has another question, you can send it to the email address formations@ntu.ac.uk. We've had a few, so I think we've got a few minutes so I can pose a couple of the audience questions to you. But I think most of them will probably be saved for the discussion afterwards. So one of the first questions we've had, thanks you both first very much for a very interesting discussion. This is from one of our doctoral students at NTU, Beth Evans, and she asks, Sharon, you suggested that there was a freedom associated with writing fiction in comparison to the perhaps difficult or painful processes of biography or transcribing reality. She says this is a very interesting concept, and she wonders whether you could discuss it more and give some examples of how you've seen that comparison.
Okay, I mean, first, thank you, Panya, because you put me through my paces there, and I really enjoyed it. So thank you.
Pleasure.
Beth, I guess what I'm interested in is that some people who work on memoir tend to think that it's the place where activists will write and that is in some way more reliable than fiction, even to the extent that fiction can be seen as inherently dishonest because it's imaginative. I don't think that way. The fictions, the literature that SNCC wrote is just as rooted in real people, real places, real projects, demonstrations, events, activists, as any other form of writing. And sometimes activists are mentioned by name. And I think I said that sometimes they may be composite characters. Sometimes particular projects are mentioned by name. And, you know, I did wonder while I was writing it whether some SNCC activists knew that their colleagues had written about experiences they'd shared or even about them in this way in literature. I think it's a safer space because it affords fewer boundaries. And I think that SNCC's writers have always blurred the boundaries. They don't stick to genres. Why should they? I also think that there's a debate I have in the book about subjectivity and objectivity. And I think that objectivity, as it's often used in the civil rights context, really means a kind of white lens of looking at things, not a black experiential lens at all, and that people who write experientially are sometimes seen as romanticizing or, you know, having a vested interest that means that they can't possibly be objective. And some of SNCC's writers have written against that. Joyce Ladner being one of them, Michael Thelwell. It seems to be a privilege of distanciation, which says, you know, we can think about these things objectively. And I'm not sure what that means, and I debate that. I think that writing subjectively can happen in lots of genres, and there are interesting histories that do that too. Think about Claudia Rankine, think about Tim Tyson's work. There are so many examples outside of people in SNCC. So, I mean, I'm happy to talk to you about it on another occasion, Beth, as well, in more detail.
We've had another really interesting question from Ramisha Rafiq, who's one of our master's students at NTU. She asks, Sharon, I'm not sure if you know that November is officially Islamophobia Awareness Month. So in spirit of that, following Black History Month, Stokely Carmichael of SNCC was known to be influenced by Malcolm X, who was influential in what became the Black Power movement and the Nation of Islam, or Black Muslims. Where do you think Black Muslim minorities fit within SNCC? Are they overlooked? And is this something that you've explored in your work? And she says, given current attitudes and ideas around Islamophobia and tackling Islamophobia in literary works, is this something that you have something to say about or have any insight into?
Yes, I mean, there are a number. It's very interesting that I think at one point, John Lewis said that Muhammad Speaks, which was the Nation of Islam, of course, not Malcolm X, a very different version, but that it covered more of the civil rights movement in the South than most other newspapers, which was a surprise to me before I started looking into it. In terms of Islamophobia, there are Muslims in SNCC. There are people who've taken Muslim names. I mentioned Willie Ricks earlier in terms of being the character in a short story as well as a SNCC activist who becomes Makasa Dada. So there are lots of examples of SNCC thinking through Islam and Judaism, and as well as Christianity, which was the background of a number of people in SNCC, and also not thinking about religion at all. So being turned off by religion too. In other words, with a group of people like this who are intelligent, thoughtful, debating, all these things come to the fore. There are also Muslim activists within SNCC who join SNCC. So it's such a heterogeneous organisation. It's really hard to keep up. One of the things that I needed to do was to know the names really well, so I could spot when they'd written fiction. You know, if you don't know that that person is a SNCC activist or volunteer, you could miss what they've written. So it's something that's an interesting idea. I must say that I'm thinking about it more now in what I'm working on than I was then in terms of the internal culture, because people who self-identified as Muslim in that moment were not among the most prevalent writers writing about SNCC's culture, particularly in the first half of the 1960s. But it's really interesting, and we might think of having a discussion about this as part of formations in the future, and we should.
Yeah. A final quick one, perhaps then. Nicole Thiara, one of our colleagues in English at NTU, asks, what was your most surprising find in the archive?
Well, I did find a poem that James Foreman had tucked into the free Huey Newton edition of Black Dialogue. And he'd written a poem called Mother Africa. And it wasn't archived because it was inside the publication. So I immediately put my hand up and said, I found this, so that it could be archived in the future. But it felt very much like a really exciting find, because it had all these scribbles and crossings out on it. You know, you could clearly see the working out of him coming to this poem, and I do talk about it in the book. So that was pretty exciting. I think so many of the things that I've found have been to me, because right at the beginning, I started to find works by SNCC activists, and I thought, I wonder if they'll all be forged in the same campus mould. If these people began writing for student newspapers and then moved their writing through SNCC and out of SNCC. And of course, that wasn't the case, because it is such a diverse organisation. But I think that I had exciting finds along the way. Sam Block's play was one of those, not because it was performed. I think if it was written in any other context than his activism in SNCC, it would be seen as excessively sensational. And it was never put on the stage. But when you read it and you understand and know what individuals went through inside jail cells in the closed society of Mississippi at that time, and the kind of torture that could be enacted, then it's seen in context as opposed to seen as some kind of sensational dramatization of events that couldn't have happened. So although it wasn't the most aesthetically effective piece of writing, I think it was really important to me, partly because of the notes that he had as he was writing it, and just the fact that he spent so much time writing it. So, Elaine Delotte's archive is a joy, and some of the things that she wrote that are personal lyrical essays were also a wonderful find. So there's lots.
Well, I think it's probably time for us all to move into the more informal discussions. So I just want to say thank you so much to both of you for this wonderful discussion. I think lots of people have learned a lot, and it seems like the time has flown. So let's rejoin in the more informal post-book launch discussion in a moment. So if people would like to join us there, please do start to join us, wait for us. It might take a couple of minutes for us to move over to the other meeting. So if we're not there immediately, please do hang on for us, where you can continue to ask your questions and we can carry on the discussion.
Yes, and please do come. I'd like to hear what you think. Thank you.